What could be scarier than burning alive in front of a crowd that once cheered your name with excitement? A terrifying scene, smoke, screams, and at the center of it all, a man whose life and death became a symbol of a conflict that shook the very foundations of the Catholic Church. This is the story of Girolamo Savonarola, a monk who dared to challenge the Pope and ended up in the flames, becoming the victim of a brutal execution carried out by the church he had tried to change. Florence in the late 15th century was one of the brightest centers of the Renaissance, a city where art, politics, and religion intertwined. However, it was in this turbulent city that a movement emerged which profoundly changed the face of Italian society. This movement was led by a monk named Girolamo Savonarola, whose sermons shook society, striking at the very heart of both religious and political leaders. Savonarola came to Florence as an advocate of strict morality and repentance, but at some point he became a threat to everything that held power, both in the church and among the aristocrats. His sermons against corruption in the church, against the luxury and immorality of the Florentine aristocracy, made him a cult figure among the common people. The monk condemned excess, sin, and immorality that prevailed in Italy during the Renaissance. But his calls for a return to modesty and repentance were not just words. He predicted calamities and misfortunes for those who continued to live in luxury. As each day passed, his following grew, and within a few years, Savonarola led an almost revolutionary movement in the very heart of Florence. He dreamed of restoring true Christianity, of a church reform that would bring holiness back to a world mired in sin. Savonarola sought to challenge Pope Alexander VI, whom he saw as the embodiment of moral decay. He openly accused the Pope of debauchery and hypocrisy, something absolutely unacceptable at the time. While the Pope reveled in his power and wealth, Savonarola exposed the corruption of the church and spoke of the revival of a true church, one free from corruption, indulgences, and immoral priests. However, his courage and uncompromising stance brought him into conflict with the most powerful religious force of the time, the Pope himself. Pope Alexander VI, who was certainly not willing to yield to some fanatic monk who cast a shadow on the entire church, could not allow Savonarola to continue his public accusations. But what is surprising is that the Pope did not immediately resort to execution. Instead, he decided to wait for Savonarola to make a mistake that would give him an opportunity to accuse him of heresy and witchcraft. However, Savonarola continued his preaching, becoming more deeply entangled in conflict with both the church and the authorities. When his enemies within the city of Florence, including those who had once been his allies, accused him of using magic to gain power, his fate was sealed. These accusations were not just words, they were deadly. Accusation of witchcraft at that time meant an inevitable punishment. Savonarola was arrested, and his followers were seized under the brutal pressure from the church and secular authorities. In prison, he was tortured to extract a confession. His moral strength, his faith in his ideas and in the truth did not allow him to renounce his words, even under torture. Despite his perseverance, Savonarola was found guilty of heresy and witchcraft. His death sentence was signed, and in 1498 he was publicly condemned and sentenced to be burned at the stake. To make an example of him, the authorities chose the most brutal and public form of execution to suppress not only Savonarola, but also his ideas. He was burned at the stake in Piazza Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and his death was a shock to all of Europe. The pyre on which Savonarola was burned became not only a symbol of his martyrdom, but also of how both religious and secular powers easily dispose of those who challenge the established order. Yet, Savonarola's death did not erase his ideas. For many people, especially the common folk of Florence, it became a symbol of how far one could go in the struggle for one's ideals. His martyrdom inspired future generations who continued to fight against corruption and debauchery in the church and society. The most interesting thing is that the execution of Savonarola did not kill his ideas, but only made them more popular. Many of his followers, mystics and preachers, continued to speak of his teachings. Many considered him a martyr whose ideas would live long after his death. After Savonarola's execution, the church did everything in its power to erase his name from memory, but this turned out to be impossible. Even long after his death, Florentines continued to discuss his ideas, and many people across Europe were inspired by his struggle. Some historians believe that Savonarola's death was a mistake for Pope Alexander VI and the Catholic Church. Perhaps, had Savonarola lived, his ideas might have led to real reforms within the Church. However, his execution also showed how deeply religious and political elites feared any threat to their position. The Church did everything to destroy his memory, but instead it turned him into a legend. The legacy of Savonarola is still a subject of discussion. For some, he was a fanatic who went too far in his fight for morality. For others, he was a hero who tried to change the world. But one thing remains undeniable. His life and death left an indelible mark on the history of the Renaissance and the history of the Catholic Church. His tragedy became a lesson for those who dared to challenge the system and try to change what seemed unchangeable. The fate of Girolamo Savonarola is not just a story about a monk who became the victim of the Catholic Church. It is, above all, a story about the clash of ideals, the clash of two worlds, the world of religion, built on centuries of tradition, and the world that sought change, purification, and reform. Savonarola was not just a monk, he was a driving force who tried to turn the course of history. He was a man who believed that faith should be sincere and the church should be holy. He saw the world in black and white and could not tolerate what was happening around him. When Savonarola came to Florence, he found it in a state of cultural and moral decay. At that time, the city was known for its magnificence, wealth, art, and culture, but it was also a place where luxury, immorality, and moral degradation had infiltrated daily life. Aristocrats threw lavish feasts, indulging in extravagant meals, while the church, which should have been the light for the people, was mired in corruption. Savonarola was not pleased with what he found in the city, and he decided that the time had come for change. But these changes could not be peaceful. As a man who came with the idea of moral purification, he began his preaching to return Florence to true faith, to true Christianity. He urged the townspeople to abandon everything unnecessary, the luxury, the immorality, the wealth that had an exclusively sinful nature. Savonarola demanded that people return to religious values, and for this, he was ready to fight with any forces that stood in the way of his beliefs. But in his quest for truth and order, he forgot about the reality of political games. This was the moment when Savonarola truly came into conflict with the opposing force, the Catholic Church. The Church, in the form of Pope Alexander VI and his associates, could not allow a monk with such radical views to become a threat to their power. At the moment when he became too influential and too popular, his threat became real. The Pope could not afford to lose control over Florence. He could not afford to lose influence over such an important city. Intrigues, in which even the highest officials participated, began to fill Florence. And as soon as rumors about a possible political and religious threat from Savonarola started to spread, old enemies began searching for ways to eliminate him. They used everything they could, from manipulating public opinion to creating false accusations. All this played a part in Savonarola's being accused of witchcraft and heresy. Witchcraft was an accusation that at the time meant death. Anyone accused of witchcraft was practically doomed. Despite his strength of spirit and faith in his truth, Savonarola found himself in a trap from which there was no escape. His confession of witchcraft and dealings with demonic forces in the eyes of the church left him no chance for salvation. Moreover, even his followers, those who had once been loyal to him, began to turn away, fearing the consequences that might follow their support for Savonarola. His arrest and brutal torture became a symbol of how easily a person could be destroyed if their ideas started to threaten the established order. Savonarola underwent tortures that would have broken any other person, but not him. He was convinced that his teachings held the truth, and even under torture, he did not renounce his words. However, his devotion to his ideas could not stop the process that had been set in motion. He was declared a heretic, and his fate was sealed. He was burned at the stake, and his death became not just a tragedy, but a symbol. This pyre, which burned his body, also became a symbol of the struggle against religious tyranny, a symbol of how the Church sought to destroy anything that opposed its power. Savonarola's burning at the stake in Piazza Santa Maria Novella marked a moment when Florence and Italy as a whole experienced not just a tragedy, but the beginning of a new era. But surprisingly, even after his death, Savonarola's ideas continued to live on. His death did not make his ideas less appealing to ordinary people. On the contrary, it only strengthened their significance. His followers did not disappear. On the contrary, they became even more determined in their efforts to expose the vices that Savonarola had so desperately condemned. For a long time after his death, Florence experienced political instability, and Savonarola's ideas continued to have an impact. Even despite the authorities' attempts to erase his memory, his image remained alive in the hearts of the people. Many people, especially those who saw Savonarola not just as a monk, but as a symbol of resistance against a corrupt society, continued to support his teachings. Thus, death did not mark the end of his path, but rather the beginning of a new movement that continued to grow. Despite its victory, the Church did not come out unscathed. Having rid itself of Savonarola, it was unable to defeat his ideas. Those who survived him continued to speak of him, searching for the truth in his words, seeking ways to bring about the reforms he so passionately desired. Soon after his execution, Pope Alexander VI was killed as a result of intrigue and political maneuvering. This was a tragic and ironic ending for the Pope, who had tried to destroy Savonarola and his ideas. Despite all this, Savonarola himself remains an important figure in the history of the Renaissance. Even today, his persona continues to provoke debates among historians. Some consider him a hero, a fighter for truth and a brighter future, while others view him as a fanatic who did not account for all the consequences of his struggle. But one thing remains undeniable. His name became a symbol of the struggle against cruel political and religious forces, and his death became a vivid reminder that any attempt to change the world, regardless of its good intentions, can lead to tragic consequences. Savonarola became a martyr, but his ideas did not die with him. He left a legacy that continued to influence the social movements that began to fight for justice and morality. So, despite all the efforts of the Pope and his followers to erase him from history, Savonarola lived on not only in his teachings, but also in the actions of those who followed his path.